September 1940. Somewhere over the green fields of Kent, England, Flight Lieutenant James Morrison pushed his Spitfire into a dive, chasing a German Messerschmitt Bf 109 through the cloudy sky. His finger hovered over the trigger. Just a few more seconds and he would have a clear shot. Then it happened. The same thing that killed 12 of his fellow pilots that month. His engine coughed, sputtered, and died completely. The propeller stopped spinning. Morrison's plane fell from the sky like a stone while the German fighter pulled away easily. Morrison barely made it back to base, gliding his dead plane onto the grass runway with his heart pounding in his chest. This was not bad luck. This was happening every single day across the English Channel. British pilots faced a terrifying problem that was costing them the entire war. When Spitfires pushed their noses down to chase enemy planes or dodge attacks, their engines lost all power. 1,030 horsepower dropped instantly to zero. The fuel stopped flowing. Gravity worked against them. Meanwhile, German pilots could dive and climb at full throttle however they wanted. Their engines maintained maximum power through every maneuver. In combat, this meant German fighters could outspeed British planes in the most critical moments of dogfights. The numbers told a grim story. In August and September of 1940, the Royal Air Force lost over 500 planes. Many crashed not because of enemy bullets, but because their own engines betrayed them at the worst possible moment. Britain was losing the Battle of Britain, and if they lost this battle, Hitler would invade their island home. The best engineers in England worked day and night to fix this problem. These men had fancy degrees from Cambridge and Oxford. They wore white coats and worked in clean laboratories. They built wind tunnels and ran thousands of calculations. They tried 17 different designs for new carburetors. They tested pressure pumps and fuel injection systems. Each solution cost thousands of pounds and took weeks to build. Each solution failed. The engine problem remained. Pilots kept dying. The engineers scratched their heads and returned to their drawing boards, convinced they needed even more complex mathematics and more expensive equipment. Into this desperate situation walked someone nobody expected. Her name was Dorothy, though everyone called her Dot. She was a black woman in her late 20s who worked as a mechanic's assistant at the Farnborough Aircraft Testing Facility. Dot grew up in London, the daughter of a railway porter. She never went to university. She learned about engines by watching her father fix motorcycles in their tiny garage behind their house. When the war started, she applied for jobs at aircraft factories. Most places turned her away the moment she walked through the door. One hiring manager actually laughed and said, women belonged in kitchens, not workshops. Another told her they didn't hire her kind. But Farnborough needed every pair of hands they could get, so they hired her to sweep floors and hand tools to the real mechanics. Dot spent her days in the massive hangar, watching mechanics tear apart Merlin engines and put them back together. She noticed things. She asked questions. Most of the men ignored her or told her to mind her business, but she kept watching and learning. She saw how the fuel floated in the carburetor bowl like water in a cup. She understood that when a plane tipped forward, that fuel sloshed away from the intake pipe, just like tilting a glass of water. The engine starved. It was really quite simple when you thought about it. But nobody asked Dot what she thought. One afternoon in late September, Dot was cleaning up the workshop when she overheard 3 senior engineers arguing. They were looking at blueprints spread across a table. One engineer proposed installing a second fuel pump that would cost £50 per plane and take 2 months to manufacture. Another suggested redesigning the entire carburetor system, which would require pulling every Spitfire out of service for a week. The third engineer said they should just teach pilots to avoid negative gravity maneuvers, which was like telling soldiers to avoid getting shot. Dot swept the floor near their table, listening carefully. She thought about her father's old motorcycle, how he once fixed a leaking fuel line with a washer and a bit of rubber. She thought about the carburetor bowl and the sloshing fuel. An idea formed in her mind. It seemed so obvious, so simple, maybe too simple. That evening, Dot stayed late in the workshop. She found a discarded carburetor that mechanics had tossed in the scrap bin. She took a thin metal disc from a pile of spare parts. Using a drill, she made a small hole in its center, about the width of her pinky finger. She installed this disc inside the carburetor, right where the fuel entered the bowl. The disc would restrict the fuel flow just enough to keep the bowl from flooding, but the small hole would still let fuel through steadily, even when the plane turned upside down. It took her 20 minutes to make. It cost nothing. She put the modified carburetor on the workbench and went home, wondering if she should even mention her little experiment to anyone. The next morning, she showed her modification to Frank, an older mechanic who sometimes treated her like a human being instead of furniture. Frank looked at the disc with the hole in it. He turned it over in his weathered hands. He asked Dot to explain her thinking. She told him about the sloshing fuel, about keeping the bowl from flooding, about maintaining steady pressure. Frank nodded slowly. Then he laughed. Not a mean laugh, but a surprised laugh. He said the Cambridge boys would call this the stupidest idea they had ever heard. They would say it was idiotic, ridiculous, impossible. They had spent months building complicated solutions with advanced mathematics and expensive equipment. How could a washer with a hole in it possibly solve the greatest engineering problem of the war? It was too stupid to work. The engineers would laugh her out of the room. Frank held the metal disc up to the light streaming through the hangar window. The hole in the center measured exactly 0.06 inches across. Dot had drilled it carefully using a precision bit she borrowed from the toolbox. Frank asked her how she knew this size would work. Dot admitted she didn't know for certain. She just figured the hole needed to be big enough to let fuel through, but small enough to prevent flooding. It was a guess based on watching hundreds of carburetors come through the workshop. Frank rubbed his chin and made a decision that could get him fired. He told Dot they would test it, but they had to keep it secret. If the test failed and the brass found out they had modified official equipment without permission, they would both be sacked. Over the next 3 days, Dot refined her design using scrap metal from the workshop bins. She worked during her lunch breaks and stayed after her shift ended. The other mechanics walked past her workbench without asking what she was doing. They assumed she was just cleaning parts. Dot tested 5 different hole sizes, ranging from 0.05 inches to 0.08 inches. She measured each one 3 times with calipers to make sure they were perfect. She weighed each disc on the precision scale. The final version weighed exactly 1.3 ounces. It was a thin circle of brass, 2 inches in diameter, with the hole drilled dead center. The edges were smooth so they wouldn't scratch the carburetor housing. The whole thing looked like a large coin with a hole punched through it. Dot could make one in 15 minutes using basic tools. The material cost was less than a shilling. Frank knew a test pilot named Captain Robert Hayes who owed him a favor. Hayes was a quiet man with gray hair who had flown planes since before Dot was born. He had survived 4 crashes and walked with a slight limp. More importantly, he didn't care what the rulebook said, if something might save lives. Frank brought Hayes to the workshop one evening after everyone else had gone home. Dot showed him the restrictor disc and explained how it worked. Hayes picked it up, held it close to his eye, and looked through the tiny hole. He asked Dot if she really thought this little thing could solve a problem that Cambridge engineers couldn't fix. Dot said she didn't know, but it seemed worth trying. Hayes smiled and said that was the most honest answer he had heard in months. The next morning, before the sun came up, Frank and Dot installed the restrictor disc in a Spitfire's carburetor. Their hands shook as they worked. If anyone caught them modifying a combat aircraft without authorization, they could be charged with sabotage. The installation took 12 minutes. They had to remove the carburetor cover, place the disc carefully over the fuel inlet, then bolt everything back together. Dot made sure every bolt was torqued to exactly 15 foot-pounds of pressure. She checked each connection twice. Frank wiped his sweaty palms on his coveralls. Hayes climbed into the cockpit as the first light of dawn painted the sky orange and pink. The Spitfire's Merlin engine roared to life, its 12 cylinders producing 1,030 horsepower. The sound echoed across the empty airfield like thunder. Hayes taxied to the runway and took off, climbing into the morning sky. Dot and Frank stood outside the hangar, shielding their eyes from the rising sun, watching the plane become a small dot against the clouds. Hayes pushed the plane through every maneuver that usually killed the engine. He rolled inverted and flew upside down for 30 seconds. Full power maintained. 1,030 horsepower screaming uninterrupted. He pushed the nose down into a steep dive, pulling -4 gravities. Maximum power all the way down. The engine never stuttered. He pulled up sharply, then immediately pushed into another dive, still running at full throttle. After 20 minutes of the most brutal flying a Spitfire could handle, Hayes brought the plane back down. He climbed out of the cockpit with a huge grin on his weathered face. The engine had delivered full combat power the entire time. Not one cough, not one sputter, not one drop in horsepower. 0.06 inches of brass had done what months of expensive engineering could not. Hayes knew they had something important, but he also knew how the military worked. If a mechanic's assistant and a lowly workshop supervisor claimed they had solved the engine problem, they would be ignored or punished for unauthorized modifications. Hayes needed someone with rank and respect to champion this idea. He went straight to Wing Commander Thomas Peterson, the senior officer at Farnborough. Peterson was known as a fair man who cared more about results than protocol. Hayes walked into Peterson's office and told him about the test flight. Peterson was skeptical. He had seen dozens of supposed solutions fail. But Hayes insisted Peterson come to the hangar and see for himself. Peterson arrived at the workshop that afternoon with 2 other officers. He looked at Dot's restrictor disc sitting on the workbench. He picked it up, turned it over, and asked who designed it. Frank pointed at Dot, who stood nervously by the tool cabinet. Peterson stared at her for a long moment. Then he asked her to explain the principle behind it. Dot's voice was quiet at first, but she walked Peterson through the problem of fuel sloshing in the carburetor bowl and how the restrictor maintained steady pressure regardless of the plane's attitude. Peterson listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked how much it cost to make. Dot said about 10 pence for materials and 15 minutes of labor. Peterson's eyebrows went up. He asked how long it took to install. Frank said 12 minutes. Peterson looked at the other officers. One of them shook his head and said this was the stupidest thing he had ever seen. He called it absurd, ridiculous, and impossible. A washer with a hole could not solve what Cambridge's best minds could not. They should stick with the Cambridge team's fuel injection system that would be ready in 4 months. Peterson stared at him for a long moment. Then Peterson said 4 months meant 400 more dead pilots, and he would rather try something stupid that might work than wait for something brilliant that might not. He ordered Frank to install restrictors in 5 more Spitfires immediately. Over the next week, those 5 planes flew 247 combat sorties over the English Channel. Not one engine failure, not one moment of power loss. Pilots reported they could finally fight the way they were trained, diving and climbing at full throttle without fear. They could chase German fighters through any maneuver while maintaining maximum speed. For the first time, Spitfires had reliable power that let them outspeed Luftwaffe fighters in the critical moments of combat. When both planes dove, the Spitfire maintained full power, while the German plane had no such advantage anymore. The kill ratio improved dramatically. 2 weeks later, Peterson ordered restrictors installed in every Spitfire at Farnborough, then every Spitfire in southern England. Production ramped up fast because the parts were so simple to make. Any machine shop could produce 50 restrictors per day. Installation crews could modify a plane in under 15 minutes. By mid-October, over 300 Spitfires had been fitted with what pilots started calling the dot disc. The stupid idea that everyone mocked was now saving lives. The numbers told a story that nobody could ignore. In August 1940, before the restrictor disc, the Royal Air Force lost 136 Spitfires to power loss during combat maneuvers. Pilots reported their engines losing all power in 42% of all dogfights that involved negative gravity dives, 1,030 horsepower dropping to 0 in an instant. In September, those numbers barely improved. 128 planes lost, 39% failure rate. Pilots were scared to push their aircraft hard because they knew the engine might lose all power at any second, leaving them helpless while German fighters maintained full throttle. Then came October, after the restrictor discs started rolling out across RAF squadrons. Power loss during combat dropped to just 8 planes that month. The failure rate fell to 3%. By November, it was down to 1%. The difference was like night and day. Pilots who had been flying scared were now flying aggressive with full, reliable power. They hunted German fighters instead of running from them. In dogfights, Spitfires could now outspeed Luftwaffe planes in dives because British engines maintained maximum horsepower, while German pilots had to wonder why their advantage had vanished. Squadron leaders reported that morale improved more in those 2 months than in the entire previous year of the war. Production crews worked around the clock to install restrictors in every Spitfire across Britain. The Farnborough workshop became a training centre where mechanics from other bases learned the installation process. Each session took 2 hours. Mechanics practiced on dummy carburetors until they could do it blindfolded. By the end of October, 23 different RAF bases had teams trained to install the dot disc. Factory workers machined the restrictors by the thousands. The brass discs stacked up in wooden crates like golden coins. Each crate held 500 units. By December 1940, over 4,000 Spitfires had been modified. The total cost for materials ran about £400. Compare that to the Cambridge team's fuel injection system, which had cost the government £50,000 to develop and still wasn't ready for combat use. The injection system required pulling each plane out of service for 2 full days and replacing half the fuel delivery components. It was complicated, expensive, and fragile. DOT's restrictor was simple, cheap, and nearly impossible to break. Before the restrictor, RAF tactics had been defensive and cautious. Flight commanders ordered pilots to avoid steep dives because losing engine power made them sitting ducks. German pilots knew about this weakness and exploited it ruthlessly. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 could dive away from danger at full throttle, while Spitfires had to level out or lose all power. This gave German fighters a huge speed advantage in combat when it mattered most. They controlled when to fight and when to run because they had reliable power and British planes did not. British pilots felt like boxers with one arm tied behind their backs. After the restrictor, everything changed. Spitfires could now maintain full power through any dive, any climb, any roll. The power advantage shifted completely. British pilots suddenly had engines as reliable as German fuel injection systems, but with the Spitfire's superior turning ability. They could outspeed Luftwaffe fighters in combat situations because their engines delivered maximum horsepower when German pilots expected them to fail. The conventional solutions that engineers tried before DOT's innovation showed just how badly they misunderstood the problem. One team designed a complex gyroscopic fuel pump that cost £60 per unit and weighed 12 pounds. It broke down after 15 hours of flight time. Another group tried a pressurized fuel tank system that required adding a compressed air bottle to each plane, reducing fuel capacity by 20%. A third approach involved teaching pilots to half-roll before diving, so gravity would work with them instead of against them. But this maneuver took precious seconds and put pilots in vulnerable positions. None of these solutions worked well enough to deploy widely. All of them were expensive, heavy, or dangerous. DOT's stupid restrictor weighed 1.3 ounces, cost 10 pence, and worked every single time. After the restrictor discs became standard equipment, German pilots noticed something had changed. British fighters suddenly became much more aggressive in combat. Spitfires dove on German formations without hesitation. The Luftwaffe intelligence officers tried to figure out what the British had done to their planes. They examined crashed Spitfires and found the brass discs in the carburetors, but German engineers initially dismissed them as unimportant. How could something so simple make such a big difference? By early 1941, the Luftwaffe realized they had been wrong. They tried to develop their own version, but their carburetors used a different design that didn't have the same flooding problem. The irony was thick. The German fuel injection system was more advanced and more expensive than the British carburetor system, but it didn't have the weakness that DOT's restrictor fixed. Sometimes being more advanced meant being more complicated without being better. The impact of the restrictor showed up in specific battles that changed the course of the war. On November 3, 1940, Squadron 242 engaged a formation of 20 German bombers over Kent. Before the restrictor, This squadron had lost 3 pilots in October when their engines quit during attack dives. This time, all 12 Spitfires dove hard on the bomber formation without a single engine failure. They shot down 7 bombers and damaged 4 more without losing a single British plane. The squadron leader wrote in his report that the restrictor had given them confidence to fight the way they trained. That confidence made all the difference. Similar stories came from squadrons across southern England. Pilots stopped worrying about their engines and started focusing on their tactics and their aim. The psychological effect was just as important as the mechanical fix. Fear had been killing as many pilots as bullets. Now the fear was gone. In January 1941, Wing Commander Peterson submitted an official report to the Air Ministry documenting the success of the restrictor disc. The report included detailed statistics, pilot testimonials, and cost comparisons with alternative solutions. The Air Ministry reviewed the report and issued a formal commendation. The restrictor became standard equipment, not just for Spitfires, but for all RAF aircraft using float carburetors, including Hurricane fighters and some bomber models. Peterson's report mentioned Dot by name and described her background and how she developed the solution. However, the official announcement from the Air Ministry credited the Farnborough engineering team without naming any individual. This was typical of military bureaucracy. Innovations came from teams, not from people, especially not from black women who swept floors in workshops. By the spring of 1941, over 6,000 RAF aircraft had been fitted with restrictor discs. The total material cost remained under £1,000. Installation time per aircraft averaged 11 minutes. The failure rate of engines during negative gravity maneuvers stayed below 1%. Fighter Command calculated that the restrictor had prevented at least 300 engine failures that would have resulted in crashed planes and dead or injured pilots. At £2,000 per Spitfire and £10,000 to train each pilot, Dot's innovation had saved the government over £2 million in direct costs. The indirect value was impossible to measure. How do you put a price on winning the Battle of Britain? How do you calculate the worth of pilots who lived instead of died? The restrictor didn't win the war by itself, but it gave British pilots the confidence and capability to fight on equal terms with an enemy that had been better equipped and better prepared. Sometimes the smallest changes create the biggest effects. Sometimes a piece of brass with a hole in it matters more than 1,000 complicated machines. For the next 4 years, Dot's stupid idea flew through every major air battle of the European theatre, giving RAF engines the reliable power that let them outspeed the Luftwaffe when it mattered most. In May 1945, the war ended, and the restrictor disc became a standard part of aviation history, though most people never knew its story or that it came from an idea once called stupid. After the fighting stopped, aircraft engineers around the world studied the simple brass disc that had solved one of aviation's most dangerous problems. The principle behind it spread far beyond military planes. Commercial airlines in the late 1940s adopted similar restrictors for their passenger aircraft. These planes used the same float carburetor design that caused problems in Spitfires, and they faced the same fuel starvation issues during turbulence or steep climbs. Pan American Airways installed modified restrictors in their fleet of Douglas DC-6 aircraft in 1948 after 3 incidents where engines cut out during bad weather. The restrictor design was adjusted to allow slightly more fuel flow, since passenger planes didn't need to perform combat maneuvers, but the core concept remained exactly the same. A simple disc with a precisely measured hole that kept fuel flowing steadily, no matter how the plane moved through the sky. Dot's life after the war took a path that nobody would have predicted from her brief moment of fame in 1940. When the war ended, the aircraft factories and workshops laid off thousands of workers who were no longer needed. Dot lost her job at Farnborough in June 1945, along with most of the other women who had worked there during the emergency. She applied for engineering positions at several companies but was turned down every time. One hiring manager told her that the war was over and women should go back to their proper place in the home. Another said they needed to give jobs to the men returning from combat, which was fair enough, but it still meant Dot was out of work. She eventually found a job at a small garage in London, fixing cars and motorcycles. The owner didn't care that she was black or that she was a woman. He cared that she could diagnose a broken engine faster than anyone he had ever seen. Dot worked at that garage for 23 years until she retired in 1968. The official recognition Dot received was minimal and came far too late. Wing Commander Peterson wrote several letters to the Air Ministry between 1945 and 1950, trying to get Dot some kind of formal acknowledgement for her contribution to the war effort. The Air Ministry responded each time with polite letters, saying they appreciated his input, but that wartime innovations were the result of team efforts and they could not single out individuals for recognition. In 1952, a military historian writing a book about the Battle of Britain interviewed Peterson about the engine problem and its solution. Peterson told him about Dot and showed him the original restrictor disc that still sat on his desk as a paperweight. The historian included a brief mention of Dot in his book, calling her an unnamed workshop assistant who had suggested a modification that proved useful. Her name didn't appear. Her race wasn't mentioned. She became a footnote without a face. In 1965, a newspaper reporter, tracking down forgotten heroes of the war, found Dot working at the garage and interviewed her. She told him the whole story, while her hands were covered in grease from rebuilding a motorcycle engine. The article ran in a small local paper with a circulation of 5,000 readers. Most people never saw it. Most people never knew. The restrictor principle evolved and adapted as engine technology advanced. When fuel injection systems became standard in the 1960s, the specific design Dot created became obsolete because injection systems didn't use float carburetors. But the core idea of restricting and regulating fuel flow under varying pressure and gravity conditions remained fundamental to engine design. Modern aircraft engines use electronic fuel management systems with dozens of sensors and computer controls, but they still incorporate flow restrictors at critical points in the fuel delivery system. Formula One racing cars use precision restrictors to limit engine power and ensure fair competition. The restrictors in modern race cars are machined to tolerances of 0.001 inches, measured with laser precision, but they serve the same basic function as Dot's brass disc from 1940. They control flow, prevent flooding, and maintain steady pressure. Space rockets use fuel restrictors to ensure propellant flows correctly, even in zero gravity. The principle that Dot discovered while sweeping floors in an aircraft hangar became a foundation of modern fluid dynamics engineering. The broader lesson of Dot's story cuts to the heart of how innovation actually happens versus how people imagine it happens. Everyone expects breakthroughs to come from laboratories and universities, from people with impressive degrees and expensive equipment. Society builds systems that filter out voices from people who don't fit the expected profile of an expert. Dot was filtered out 3 times over. She was black in a country that treated black people as second-class citizens. She was a woman in a field dominated by men who believed women couldn't understand machines. She was poor and uneducated in a world that valued fancy credentials over practical knowledge. The Cambridge engineers who spent months failing to solve the engine problem weren't bad at their jobs. They were brilliant men who knew more about mathematics and physics than Dot would ever learn, but they were trapped by their own expertise. They thought the solution had to be as complex as the equations they used to understand the problem. They couldn't see the simple answer because simplicity seemed beneath them. Dot saw the simple answer because she had no investment in complexity. She just watched fuel slosh around in a bowl and thought about how to stop it from sloshing. This pattern repeats throughout history and continues into the present day. The people closest to a problem often see solutions that experts miss because they're not blinded by theoretical knowledge. Farmers know things about soil and weather that agricultural scientists sometimes overlook. Nurses notice patterns in patient care that doctors miss. Janitors understand building systems better than architects, but society rarely asks these people for their insights. Their knowledge is dismissed as merely practical rather than intellectual, as if solving real problems was somehow less valuable than writing papers about theoretical ones. Today, companies spend billions on research and development while ignoring suggestions from their factory floor workers. Governments hire expensive consultants to solve problems that community members already know how to fix. The same barriers that kept Dot's voice from being heard in 1940 still keep countless voices silent in 2025. How many solutions are we missing because we only listen to certain kinds of people? How many innovations never happen because the person with the idea doesn't have the right credentials or the right skin color or the right accent? The restrictor disc sits in the Imperial War Museum in London, displayed in a glass case alongside a Spitfire propeller and a pilot's helmet. The placard next to it reads, "Carburetor Restrictor, circa 1940, developed at RAF Farnborough to solve fuel starvation problems in combat aircraft. The innovation is preserved, but the innovator remains invisible." Dot died in 1987 at the age of 74, still living in the same small London flat where she had lived since the war. She never married and had no children. A handful of people attended her funeral, mostly neighbors and a few regulars from the garage where she had worked for so long. The newspaper that had interviewed her in 1965 ran a brief obituary that didn't mention the restrictor disc or the war or anything that made her life remarkable. She was remembered as a quiet woman who was good with engines. Perhaps that's how she would have wanted it. She never sought fame or credit. She just saw a problem and fixed it, because fixing problems was what she knew how to do. The question isn't whether Dot deserved recognition, because clearly she did. The question is how many other Dots are out there right now, seeing solutions that everyone else is missing, waiting for someone to finally listen.